Have you ever felt the quiet fear that rises when God asks you to trust Him without guarantees? Have you noticed how easy it is to say, "I trust God," until trust begins to cost you something real? And have you ever sensed that the moment true trust is required is often the exact moment most hearts step back? There is a cost to truly trusting God, not a cost measured in suffering alone, but in surrender. And Saint Thérèse of Lisieux understood this cost with extraordinary clarity. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux once said, "True trust does not collapse loudly. It retreats quietly when the heart is asked to let go of control." Subscribe if you desire to walk this little way and learn how trust transforms the soul from within. Saint Thérèse knew that trusting God is not primarily an emotional act. It is an interior decision, often made in silence, often made when nothing feels certain. For her, trust was not a feeling of peace. It was a choice to remain open when fear suggested withdrawal. Most people step back from trust not because they stop believing in God, but because trust asks something uncomfortable: the surrender of self-reliance, the abandonment of control, the acceptance of not understanding, the humility of being small. Trust costs the ego its illusions of strength. Imagine a child standing at the edge of a step too high to climb alone. The parent's arms are open, inviting. The child believes the parent is there, but belief alone does not move the child. Trust does, and trust requires stepping forward without certainty of how the landing will feel. This is where most hearts hesitate. Saint Thérèse wrote, "I choose all that Jesus wills even when I do not understand." This sentence reveals the price of trust, letting God choose when you would prefer to decide, letting God lead when you would prefer clarity, letting God carry when you would prefer control. Trust is costly because it exposes your littleness. Thérèse did not hide from this cost. She embraced it. She understood that God does not ask trust from the strong, but from the willing. Trust, for her, was not heroic confidence. It was childlike abandonment, the willingness to be led without knowing the path. Picture Thérèse walking through the convent corridors, her future unknown, her health fragile, her inner life often dry. She did not feel powerful. She did not feel certain. Yet she continued to trust, not because she felt safe, but because she chose to remain open. Most people step back at this point. They still pray, but cautiously. They still believe, but selectively. They still hope, but with conditions. They trust God until trust demands silence, waiting, vulnerability, or loss of control. And yet Thérèse teaches that this very cost is the doorway to freedom. The soul that dares to trust without safety nets begins to rest, not in circumstances but in God Himself. Trust does not remove fear instantly. It walks forward despite fear. This is the beginning of the little way, not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide. As this journey unfolds, we will discover why trust feels so costly, what the soul fears losing, and how Saint Thérèse reveals that what is surrendered is never truly lost. It is transformed. For now, remain with this question quietly. Where has God invited me to trust, and where have I stepped back? That question is the threshold. True trust begins exactly where comfort ends. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux understood that the cost of trusting God is not dramatic suffering, but the quiet loss of inner control. It is the moment when the soul realizes that trusting God means no longer arranging outcomes, no longer protecting itself emotionally, and no longer demanding explanations before surrender. This is where many hearts step back, not because they stop loving God, not because they stop believing, but because trust asks the soul to remain open without reassurance. The heart naturally wants signs, it wants clarity, it wants confirmation that everything will turn out well. Trust, however, often removes these supports. It leaves the soul standing in a space where nothing is guaranteed except one thing: God's presence. Thérèse wrote, "It is confidence, and nothing but confidence, that must lead us to love." Confidence, not certainty. Love, not control. This distinction is crucial. Certainty relies on visible outcomes. Confidence relies on God's heart. Trust becomes costly the moment the soul realizes it must choose confidence without certainty. Imagine a child walking in the dark, holding a parent's hand. The child cannot see the path, The child does not know where the steps lead, but the hand is warm. The presence is real. Trust is not based on visibility, but on relationship. Saint Thérèse lived her spiritual life exactly in this way. Much of her interior journey was marked by dryness, silence, and uncertainty. She did not receive constant consolation. She did not feel continually affirmed. Yet she trusted, not because she felt supported, but because she chose to remain small. This is the hidden cost of trust, accepting not to feel strong, accepting not to feel secure, accepting not to feel in control. Trust strips the soul of spiritual self-sufficiency, and this stripping is uncomfortable. The heart fears exposure, it fears dependence, it fears the vulnerability of leaning fully on God. This fear whispers, what if I fall? What if I'm disappointed? What if God doesn't come through the way I expect? Thérèse answers this fear not with argument, but with surrender. She teaches that trust does not guarantee comfort, it guarantees belonging. And belonging is deeper than reassurance. Most people step back here. They trust God partially, cautiously, conditionally. They keep emotional distance as a form of safety. They rely on prayer, but also on self-protection. They believe, but they do not abandon themselves. Yet Thérèse shows that partial trust brings partial peace. The soul remains tense because it still carries itself. Full trust costs more, but it gives more. It costs the illusion of control. It costs emotional self-defense. It costs the need to understand everything, but what it gives in return is quiet freedom. The soul that trusts deeply no longer fights to hold itself together. It allows God to hold it instead, even when the path is unclear, even when emotions fluctuate, even when answers are delayed. This is the second threshold of the little way, choosing confidence over certainty. What the soul fears losing when it truly trusts God is not always obvious. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux saw that beneath hesitation lies a deeper anxiety, the fear of losing oneself. Trust feels dangerous because it threatens the fragile structures the heart uses to feel safe: control, predictability, self-definition, and emotional independence. The heart wonders, often unconsciously, if I trust completely, who will I be without my defenses? If I let go, what will remain of me? If I stop managing everything, will I disappear? This fear is subtle, but powerful. Thérèse understood that the soul often equates control with identity. We define ourselves by what we manage, what we endure, what we hold together. Trusting God challenges this identity. It asks the soul to accept being carried rather than carrying itself. And this feels like loss. But Thérèse reveals a paradox. What feels like loss is actually liberation. She wrote, "The more I abandon myself, the happier I become. Not because life becomes easier, but because the soul becomes lighter." Imagine holding sand tightly in your fist. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips through your fingers. When you open your hand, the sand rests quietly. Trust works the same way. The tighter you grip your life, your future, your emotions, the more anxiety increases. When you open your hand, peace enters. Yet opening the hand feels risky. The soul fears losing control of outcomes. It fears losing the image of strength. It fears losing the illusion of independence. It fears losing the right to decide everything on its own terms. Thérèse invites the soul to lose these things, not to diminish it, but to free it. In her little way, she discovered that identity is not built by control but by belonging. She did not become smaller by trusting God. She became more herself. Trust did not erase her personality, it purified it. It removed the weight that distorted love. This is why most people step back. They sense, even without words, that true trust will rearrange their inner world, that it will ask them to stop defining themselves by effort and start defining themselves by love, that it will ask them to rest rather than strive. And rest feels unfamiliar to a soul trained to survive through self-reliance. Consider your own heart. What do you fear losing if you trusted God more fully? Your sense of control? Your emotional defenses? Your carefully constructed plans? Your ability to predict what comes next? These fears do not mean you lack faith. They mean you are human. Thérèse does not condemn these fears. She gently invites the soul to walk through them. She teaches that trust is not a single leap, but a series of small surrenders, each one loosening the grip a little more. Trust costs the soul its false supports, but in return, it receives something deeper, stability that does not depend on circumstances. When the soul stops relying on what it can manage, it begins to rely on who God is. And who God is does not change. This is the quiet exchange at the heart of the little way. The soul gives up control and receives peace. There is a moment in the spiritual life when trusting God becomes costly, not because of fear, but because of silence. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux understood this dimension of trust more deeply than most. She discovered that the greatest test of confidence in God is not suffering, not confusion, not even weakness, but remaining open when God feels quiet. Silence unsettles the heart, when answers do not come, when prayer feels dry, when emotions offer no reassurance, when God seems distant, even though faith remains. This is where many hearts step back. They do not abandon God outwardly. They continue their routines, they maintain appearances, but inwardly they pull away, protecting themselves from disappointment. Thérèse refused this retreat. She wrote, "I did not always feel consolation, but I never stopped trusting." This sentence reveals the cost of trust in silence, choosing relationship without emotional reward. Silence tempts the soul to believe that trust has failed, that prayer is useless, that abandonment was naive, that openness was a mistake, and so the heart begins to close, quietly, cautiously, as a form of self-protection. Trust in silence costs the soul its demand for reassurance. Imagine a child calling for a parent in the dark. There is no immediate reply. The child feels fear rising. The easy response is to retreat inward, to stop calling, to protect the heart from disappointment. But trust does something else. It waits. It remains open. It believes presence even without sound. Saint Thérèse lived long periods of interior darkness, especially toward the end of her life. She did not feel God's nearness. She did not feel certainty. She did not feel comfort. Yet she trusted, not because she felt held, but because she chose to remain small. She wrote, "I believe because I choose to believe." This is mature trust, not driven by emotion, but by love. Silence strips the soul of its last supports. It removes feelings, clarity, and spiritual sweetness. What remains is the bare choice. Will I trust God for who He is, or only for how He makes me feel? This is the place where most people step back. They still believe, but with distance. They still pray, but without vulnerability. They still hope, but with conditions. Trust becomes cautious. Thérèse teaches that this cautious trust is understandable, but it is not freedom. True freedom comes when the soul dares to trust God even when nothing responds, even when silence feels heavy, even when the heart feels alone. This kind of trust costs deeply. It costs emotional comfort. It costs immediate reassurance. It costs the satisfaction of feeling close. But it gives something greater, union that is no longer dependent on feeling. The soul that trusts in silence becomes anchored. It no longer rises and falls with emotions. It no longer demands proof of God's love. It rests in the knowledge that love remains even unseen. Saint Thérèse shows that this is not heroic strength. It is childlike persistence. The child who waits, the child who stays, the child who trusts the heart of the parent more than the noise of reassurance. When trust passes through silence and remains, it begins to transform daily life. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux teaches that true trust does not remove difficulties. It changes how the soul carries them. The weight remains, but it no longer crushes. The path continues, but it no longer feels lonely. This is where the cost of trust becomes visible. A trusting soul lives differently. It stops demanding that life feels secure before it moves forward. It stops waiting for emotional clarity before it loves. It stops postponing peace until circumstances improve. Trust reshapes ordinary moments. Thérèse did not live a dramatic or externally extraordinary life. Her days were repetitive, hidden, filled with small tasks and quiet sacrifices. Yet she believed these were the precise places where trust either grew or collapsed. Trust was not proven in mystical moments, but in the way she accepted interruptions, misunderstandings, fatigue, and monotony. She wrote, "Everything is a grace, not because everything felt good, but because everything could be trusted to God." A soul that trusts God deeply no longer resists daily inconveniences with the same intensity. It still feels irritation, it still experiences weariness, it still notices injustice, but instead of tightening inward, it yields outward. It allows God to enter the moment rather than fighting to escape it. Imagine a small daily frustration, a delay, a mistake, a misunderstanding. The natural instinct is to tense up, to resist, to complain internally. Trust does something different. It softens. It says quietly, "I do not understand this, but I trust you here." This costs something. It costs the satisfaction of control. It costs the right to constant explanation. It costs the illusion that peace depends on order. But it gives something deeper, inner stability. Thérèse believed that the soul becomes peaceful, not when life becomes predictable, but when trust becomes habitual. Trust turns chaos into offering. It transforms inconvenience into surrender. It converts irritation into an opportunity for love. This is why most people step back, because trusting God in daily life means surrendering the need to manage every reaction. It means choosing gentleness when irritation feels justified. It means choosing patience when frustration feels earned. It means choosing humility when pride feels protective. Trust feels costly because it asks the soul to love when it would rather defend itself. Yet this is precisely where freedom is born. The trusting soul becomes lighter. It carries less resentment. It rehearses less fear. It clings less tightly to outcomes. Saint Thérèse teaches that this lightness is not emotional optimism, it is spiritual confidence. The confidence that God is present in the moment, not only in solutions. Trust does not change the road, it changes the way you walk on it. As this journey nears its completion, one final truth remains to be explored. What happens when the soul stops stepping back and dares to trust fully, not occasionally, not selectively, but entirely? When the soul finally stops stepping back and dares to trust God fully, something unexpected happens. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux teaches that nothing essential is lost, only what was weighing the heart down. What once felt like a frightening surrender reveals itself as a quiet homecoming. True trust does not strip the soul, it unburdens it. Thérèse discovered that the soul who entrusts everything to God does not become fragile, it becomes free. Free from the exhausting task of holding itself together, free from the constant need to predict outcomes, free from the fear of failing, disappointing, or losing control. She wrote with astonishing simplicity, "I have found my happiness and my peace in complete abandonment." This abandonment was not passivity, it was confidence. Confidence that God is Father, confidence that love precedes effort, confidence that grace works even when nothing is visible. The final cost of trusting God is the surrender of self-centered gravity, the inward pull that keeps the soul focused on itself, its fears, its plans, its defenses, its outcomes. Trust shifts the center. Life no longer revolves around how will I manage, but around who is carrying me. This shift changes everything. The soul that trusts fully no longer measures life by success or failure, but by fidelity. It no longer asks, "Did this work out?" but "Did I remain open?" It no longer evaluates prayer by emotion, but by presence. It no longer defines holiness as strength, but as availability. Thérèse believed that God delights in the soul that dares to be small without fear. She taught that spiritual childhood is not immaturity, it is wisdom. The wisdom of knowing that love is safest when it is placed entirely in God's hands. Imagine a child finally falling asleep in a parent's arms after resisting rest all day. The struggle ends not because the child solved anything, but because the child stopped resisting being held. This is the final movement of trust. Most people never reach this point. They trust partially. They surrender selectively. They step forward, then step back. But the soul who remains finds something rare, deep interior peace. Not because life becomes easy, not because problems disappear, but because the heart stops fighting reality and begins to rest in love. Saint Thérèse shows that when trust becomes complete, fear loses its authority, anxiety softens, the future feels less threatening, the present feels inhabited by God. Even suffering, though still painful, is no longer isolating. Trust does not remove the cross. It changes who carries it. And in this final truth lies the freedom Thérèse promised. The soul that truly trusts God loses nothing that was meant to remain and gains everything it was meant to receive. Peace, lightness, belonging, love without calculation. This is why trusting God is costly and why it is worth everything, because the cost is only the illusion of control, and the reward is life held securely in the hands of love itself.